Now that we've created all the anticipation, please bring to the stage and welcome to the stage FT's Moral Money editor, Simon Mundy, and his panelists to discuss achieving a just transition.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. It's great to be back in Toronto. My name is Simon Mundy. I'm the editor of the Financial Times' Moral Money newsletter, in which we explore environmental, social, other ethical questions around business and finance. And through my work at Moral Money and through my climate book, Race for Tomorrow, something that's become massively, abundantly clear to me is that this transition that we're talking about simply isn't going to happen at the speed and scale that's required if it's not perceived to be just and fair and responsible. And this is something which has become more and more of a crunch topic over the past year or two as the transition has gathered pace. We're talking about justice at the international level, dealing with the absurd situation that we have at the moment about the bulk of the pain being disproportionately borne by countries that have done the least to drive the crisis. We're also talking about the domestic level, how to ensure that the costs of transition don't fall excessively upon those who are least prepared to deal with it at the national level, how to deal with the large numbers of people who still rely upon fossil fuel and other carbon-intensive industries for their livelihoods. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. It's also, I've been informed, the topic of a really interesting piece of research just published today by the PRI, which you can find under the title Social Implications of Net Zero Policies online, so do check that out. And it's what we're going to be discussing here today with a really excellent panel. To introduce first those joining us online, Karine de Boissezon is the Chief Impact Officer of EDF from France. Darren Scorgi, dialing in from South Africa, is the Head of Responsible Investment at Old Mutual. To my left, Senator Rosa Galvez is an independent senator in the Senate of Canada. To her left, Catherine McKenna is the founder and chief executive officer of Climate and Nature Solutions, as well as a former minister in the Canadian government and many other things besides. And last but certainly not least, Michael Cohen is the chief investment operating officer and chief of staff at Culpers from California. So welcome to you all and welcome to everyone joining us here in the room. I'd like to start off just by speaking to the various panelists about what this concept of a just transition really means to them and how they've been addressing it through their work. Senator Galvez, obviously in your work, you're a lawmaker, and if you speak to many people, it's going to be through the legislatures of the world that the most important progress around the transition will be made. What's been the work that you've been seeing and taking part in, and how does the idea of a just transition feed into it?
The progress is heterogeneous. I wear my hat of environmental engineer, civil engineer, and I can tell you that engineers have been ready for these transitions for the last 20 years. Canada is lagging, the world is lagging, the clock is ticking. Legislatively talking, it has to be a whole government approach. It cannot be a patchwork of legislation. It has to be holistic. And of course, there is the carbon tax, there is the taxonomy that needs to be science-based, that needs to be rendered it possible to accountability, to transparency, technology agnostic, and it's not there yet. And so we need clear rules. We have a Sustainable Jobs Act in Canada, but it's a plan to do a plan. So we cannot yet measure the progress. And I think that if I'm talking to you, the audience that are your experts in measuring and performance indicators, we need really and true indicators that let us measure the progress. So the progress should be how much money is passing from fossil fuels to renewable energy, how many greenhouse gas reductions we are making. And so I don't want you cut me because I'm a professor, so I can keep talking, okay? Uh, so we have many. We have the Net Zero Accountability Act, but we missed, and we didn't put transition plans. So that's why I had to come up with the bill, S243, that tries to patches and fill up all these gaps. And with that, I think holistically, then we have all the tools, because experts have said it's not just one type of policy. It is a set of holistic policies, bring it all together. Just one, for example, internalizing the pollution, internalizing the pollution. We have, everybody has in their legislation polluter pays. Show me where polluter pays.
Really important points, and the bill S243, which many of you will be familiar with. If you're not, then it's really worth looking up. This is a bill that Senator Galvez is trying to push through the Canadian Senate and will be a real game changer, not only in this country, but really international, send waves internationally if it does make progress, if it does get passed into law as you're trying to achieve. I'd like to move next to South Africa, partly because I started my career there and I still miss it. Darren, the idea of the just transition, it sounds differently in different parts of the world, and especially in South Africa, where there are issues around access to electricity. There's a huge coal mining and coal power sector. There are continued serious problems around unemployment, particularly youth unemployment. How does the concept of the just transition play out in South Africa, and how are you incorporating it into your work at one of the country's biggest financial institutions?
Great, thank you. And absolutely you're right. South Africa has a lot of social economic challenges. And in many African economies, we have to prioritize or rather budget our economic choices. Either we focus on economic development to meet many of these social economic challenges like social and economic inequality, poverty, unemployment, or we address global systemic challenges or risks such as climate change and biodiversity loss. I believe if we focus on repairing the overarching system, we can achieve both objectives simultaneously. So a just transition or an economic transition that brings the sort of clarity, equal opportunity, respect for planetary boundaries can only be achieved through a whole of economy or a whole of government response. And to your point, us as an asset owner with 30-year pension liabilities, this will greatly aid our purpose of being a responsible business partner to our members. Some of uh, the work that we're doing at the moment, for example, is in particularly in private markets, we're focusing on a lot more renewable energy, trying to get that into the grid. And for our extractive sectors, our mining and manufacturing sectors, we focus quite aggressively on active ownership or active engagement to get them to prepare these transition pathways and transition plans that focus not only on their own employees and sort of the the risk or the volatility that they may experience, but also the communities in which they're operating. So we encourage a bit more community engagement. And then lastly, we try to engage with policymakers and regulators more particularly on encouraging, again, the disclosure that needs to happen for us as investors to understand what's happening, but also making sure that those targets along that transition pathway are being met and achieved. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Darren. And a reminder to the audience, I've got an iPad here with your questions, which will appear as they come through. So please do keep feeding them in, and we'll get to as many of them as we can during the session. Catherine, coming to you, again, this issue of the just transition, you've worn various hats during your career. You've come at this issue in various ways. How central do you think this concept of justice is to what we're talking about? And how far have you seen it potentially becoming an obstacle if the transition is seen to be pushed in a way that isn't totally just?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me, and it's great to see so many folks here. This is a super important conversation. So I first, The language around just transition, I think, is amazing because I had to deal with real people. So people didn't really know what it was. They kind of thought maybe government would take away their job and then they never have another one. Really, the idea around a just transition came up in the context of coal. So we were phasing out coal through policy. And of course, you need to think about workers and communities. And that was critically important. And it was a little funny because I would talk to finance and they'd be like, well, lots of transitions. Maybe that's fine. They're just, disintermediation. Other industries, I said, no, we're actually bringing in policies so we get out of coal. That's like jobs and communities. So we did a task force, which sounds lame, but we actually sent folks, labor, unions, workers. We had business people, we had indigenous people, and they went to the communities. So they went to communities, like a small community in Saskatchewan, and had to sit in an audience where it was in the gym, and a bunch of people came. And they were pissed off. Like, they were like, what's going on here? And they were worried, but possibly not entirely surprised, but they had reasonable concerns that regular people have. I'm from Hamilton. If anyone knows Hamilton, just down the road, it's a steel town. And so they wanted to know, would there be jobs for themselves or their kids? Would there be training? Would there be infrastructure investments? These are very practical things. And sometimes I worry, like, governments say nice things, and then they don't deliver for regular people. They just wanted to know, are they going to be able to put food on the table? What does this mean? And so that was my experience here in Canada. I think there was mixed success. And I sometimes worry, like, we worry about legislation. I'm not sure that legislation always solves things. You got to put money down. And if you want to get off the most polluting fossil fuel, coal, like, we have to do that right now. So we should be willing to invest a lot of money. Then I worked with the UK, which UK is the first country to be totally off coal, which is amazing. Now, it was a 100-year journey, so we do not have that much time, by the way, so we got to hurry up. And it's good to have South Africa represented here because the Just Energy Transition Partnerships are actually trying to figure this out, both to get the money from dirty to clean, but also figure out how do you ensure that workers have jobs, because politicians won't do hard things if workers don't have jobs because they won't get votes. So we created the Powering Past Coal Alliance, and it was countries from around the world that were committed to getting off coal. And I think we've seen a lot of progress, a lot of countries joined, and they learned a lot from each other about how to do this. But my big concern is we don't have time. So I'm loath to ask, but there's probably a lot of Canadians here, like, who has a place in Florida? I don't know, my parents go to Florida every year. They didn't have a place, but they went to Florida. So I think a lot of people here go to Florida. And the problem is we're looking at just transition from one perspective, which is really important. I work with the London School of Economics. PRI is doing work that they will announce in the next climate conference around just transitions and where policies are going. But there's also unjust transition going on right now, whether we like it or not, right? Like, things are happening both in terms of the climate, and the real impacts that we're seeing, and they're accelerating. Another dire report today, and I'm just a person who works on facts and science and dollars and cents, and so we're not accelerating enough, but people are paying the price. And so there's the other just transition, which is, like, we're transitioning as a world. And by the way, I know sometimes in Canada we're in the unreal world about what's happening, but we are going to approach peak oil and gas. And that's going to happen, and that's going to happen whether or not we say it's a just transition or not. It's going to happen, and there will be stranded assets, and there will be impacts on communities. And so I think, and a large part of that is just China and EVs. I mean, a bunch of other things, but that's going to happen. So I think we need to be thinking about what's going to happen if we don't prepare these communities. Like, what's going to happen, take in Canada, for the oil sands communities? What's going to happen there if we don't prepare? It's not just you have to figure out a just transition and then you can do it. It may get foisted on you by circumstance, both because money is changing direction. I work with the largest asset owners, and they're doing an amazing job. So I think, look, hard things are hard in life, but it's not that hard. If you actually figure out how to reduce emissions at scale now, how to get money to clean at scale now, yes, blended finance, a whole bunch of things, and figuring out how do we do that faster, I think we can do it. But I think if we try to put everything in nice little categories, like just transition, here where it's all perfect, and then we maybe do something here, we're going to miss the point. And I lived in Indonesia for 3 years. We got to get money to these countries. They want to get out of polluting coal, but people need jobs and they need opportunities. And there's a lot of money. There's a lot of money actually in this room, if I were to add it all up, trillions of dollars. So I think this is the opportunity, but all of these things require ambition. And I'll say it up front and I'll say it at the end, like we need leadership. And you guys are the leaders here. You're at Principles for Responsible Investment. We heard Eric Esha tell some very good stories. We have asset owners here that are actually demanding action from the folks they invest in. And this is what I think we can do. But of course we need to keep people at the center, but it's already imperfect and it's not going to be orderly. It's going to be disorderly because it's already disorderly. But I think listening to developing countries, figuring out finally how to get blended finance there, actually thinking about workers and communities and what's the future for those communities and the real opportunities for jobs. And there's huge opportunities in the renewable sector, but beyond that, like it's so much bigger than that. So, I mean, I don't think you can give one answer and I don't think there's one policy, but I think it's just the ambition being there and folks being disciplined enough to actually figure out how to do it.
Thanks so much, Catherine. And of course, this conversation around international climate finance, which is at the very core of the just transition conversation globally. This is going to be such an important topic at COP29 happening in Baku just a month from now, which some are describing as a placeholder COP before Brazil, which I find perplexing because this is going to be a COP where climate finance is front and center, and that's going to be seriously important and very contentious discussions. Corinne, I'd like to turn to you, looking at the situation in France. So if we talk about the just transition and times when it's really come into focus, France, maybe more than anywhere else, when the Gilets jaunes, yellow vest protests swept the country. And I think pretty much all of those people who are out there wearing those yellow vests were doing so because they felt that this was an example of a green policy being pursued in a way which they felt was unjust. But I wonder how far this issue is really top of mind for you in the work that you do at EDF, Électricité de France. And perhaps you could talk a bit about actually what your work as Chief Impact Officer entails.
Thank you very much, Simon. Yes, the yellow vest has been clearly a trauma for France in terms of bad policy, I will say, in terms of the transition, completely underestimating the impact on people from higher carbon taxes on fuel, plus a proposal of limitation of the speed limit on the highway. And I think it's very interesting that the just transition is mainly in France about fair share in the transition. I'll give you an anecdote from a survey that has been done this week. There was a survey about 3,000 people, and we asked them how happy they were to not take flight anymore for short-term distance and to have the limitation of the speed limit, right? Their approval rate was around 50%. If you tell them that the ministers will not take the plane either, they will take the train and there will be no more private jets for the rich people, then the approval rate goes to 80%. So maybe because I'm in a communist country, I don't know. But the fact is that there is an issue about fair share. And the reality of the yellow vest is also the feeling that some people can get away with the system as it is, and some people are having the burden. So I think when we talk about just transition, it's really moving from I want to transition because I can do it from I can transition, so I will do it. So we need to give the means to people to do it. So it has to be people centric. It has to be community centric. And I think at EDF we have that luck that we are a state-owned company, which means that we have also a very special governance. I have 1/3 of my board, which is employees. I signed 20 years ago the first global CSR agreement with all the unions, Brazil, South Africa, Italy, UK, everywhere. So that means that for 20 years, we've been putting the discussion about the jobs. We've actually closed a lot of thermal assets in the past. over the last 30 years. We closed 35 coal stations. Today, it's only 0.2% of my production is coal, but I had to do the job of closing all the coal stations in the UK, in France, in Poland, etc. And the fact is, we couldn't do it if we didn't put all the people on board first. We could tell them that they will have a future with EDF, whether it's in another part of the business in production or whether they go to distribution or other part of the business. And I think this is really the only way we could manage, because we had to anticipate. Now we move from today or the past, which was calling the coal station, to another challenge now, which is I am recruiting 100,000 people in the next 10 years. And guess what? We don't have the skills. We only have, for example, 50% of the welders, of the boiler makers, of all these technicians. They are not coming out of schools, and not for everybody, right? So the green transition, of course, is going to create jobs, but not exactly where I have my needs. And we are many asking for the same kind of skills. So this is the biggest challenge that we face now as well, is how do we make sure that we actually train and we recruit and we reskill enough people to really be up for the challenge of doing this green transition. And it means as well to get women on board, because I can tell you this is a huge challenge as well for us in the industry. We have less and less women going into engineering school, doing in STEM. So we really have to change as well the image of the industry to make sure that we get diversity and inclusion as well in our jobs.
Thanks so much, Corinne. Some really great points there. And Michael, I wonder what your take on this is. And I suppose for you in your role, when it comes to the just transition, well, you're looking at opportunities to contribute to a just transition. You're also looking at risks, pitfalls that you might fall into that might involve getting it horribly wrong in one way or another. What are the key things you're looking out for when it comes to your role as one of the biggest institutional investors in the United States?
Yeah, thanks, Simon. And I think Catherine really set me up well to describe the CalPERS approach to our sustainability plan. So and it is really an ambitious plan that tries to take an integrative view of all of these issues and to the best we can put them all in a plan that serves to the benefit of our 2 million plus members that we're responsible for their long-term retirement security. So last November, we put out a Sustainable Investment 2030 plan, which sort of laid out a path for CalPERS for the next 6-7 years. At the core of it is $100 billion in climate investments by 2030. For context, the CalPERS fund right now is about $500 billion. We started, when we put the plan out, at $47 billion, so we wanted to double our climate investment over the next 6 or 7 years. And in doing so, we really have fully bought into the thesis that we think we can generate outperformance by leaning into the climate revolution and, putting the finance at the forefront and finding opportunities where we can generate alpha for our investment dollars. But surrounding that, we also sort of added in what I would consider the components of a just transition. The thing I wanted to highlight is our labor principles, which is really, I think, a fairly unique component of our sustainability plan. So the language itself, the 5 labor principles that we adopted are based on the American Investment Council and the International Labor Organization, as well as some human capital language that CalPERS already had. But I think the two most unique components of our labor principles are, first of all, that it applies to all of our asset classes. We've seen some of other organizations add in labor principles, but they're only focused on private equity or on some other component of their investment strategies, where we're all across all of our asset classes. And then the second key component is a stakeholder engagement process that's formalized so that we can track issues that, obviously, when you make an investment, you hope and plan for all of your investments to be sort of just and fair and serve workers right. because we know that satisfied workers are going to generate greater performance for the companies that we invest in. That being said, things always slip through the cracks, so we have a engagement process by which stakeholders can come to us in front of our board and, say, hey, we really think you need to look at this issue, and we now have a formal process by which we track those instances, and we can have an escalation process to make sure that all of our labor principles are being followed. That includes kind of the freedom of association for our workforces, as well as a safe and healthy environment to work in. And obviously, as climate change becomes more and more extreme, reaching that sort of safe and healthy work environment is getting harder and harder, and it'll be a challenge over the next few years to make sure our investments can meet those labor principles.
Thanks a lot, Mike. I'd like to stick with this theme of what investors can do. In fact, Dustin Lanz has asked, what can investors do in practical terms to support a just transition in their roles as asset allocators and stewards? So Michael spoke a bit to that there. Catherine, do you think Michael's covered everything? Are there other things that you would really be urging people in the room to really be thinking about in the work that they can do?
Well, I mean, I think just sharing best practices. So it's really great to hear what CalPERS is doing, but there's a lot of asset owners that are really leading the way. And this requires actually having a proper transition plan. I mean, I talk about it being easy. I mean, obviously your emissions need to go down, money needs to go dirty to clean, and you need to think about people at the bottom. But then there's a bunch of things that need to happen in your business people. So it's not shocking that there are things you're going to want to do and measure. But I think, like, I've seen asset owners all over, whether CDPQ, obviously in Canada, one of the leaders, but there are other leaders, the University Pension Plan and others that are leading the way on thinking about just transition. How do you incorporate that in your transition plan? But I also work with Temasek, and in Singapore, it's extremely important when they look at their investments. BNP has done a really great job. We actually did a report, so Climate and Nature Solutions with BNP Paribas, you can go look at on our website, which actually just shows examples of investors through the expert group report that I did, I chaired. There were 10 recommendations, and it goes through and shows what are the leaders doing. And I think part of the challenge I see, to be charitable, I'm not always charitable, but to be charitable is people actually don't really understand how do you activate these things? Like, it's easy to say emissions go down and money goes to clean, and you've got to measure it and do all these things in transition plans, but what are leaders doing? And I think that's the opportunity that when people hear, like, you guys feel free to go adopt, what CalPERS is doing with on the labor side, or go look at what other investors are doing. And the more we can actually share practical, case studies of what does it mean in a transition plan to actually implement a just transition. What are you looking at? What are you measuring? What are you reporting on? How are you engaging with different folks? I think the better it really is. And so I think there's a lot of great examples, but the number one thing is acting, right? And so the expert group report that I chaired, which was global, and it had one environmentalist, it had former governor of the Bank of China, it had a former CEO, a former head of state. It was very diverse, half women, which was also good, but we had key recommendations. And we actually saw that there was progress globally. And I think you're going to see some reports. I'm part of, I'm going to get this wrong, I'm part of different organizations, but the PRI has a task force looking at, what are the advances in terms of regulation. I think that also helps. It's not just best practice, it's not just voluntary initiatives, it's actually requiring real things from folks. So you're seeing a move towards policy, towards regulation. But I think that it's not just announcing that you've got a net zero target and then having a very light transition plan that doesn't provide guidance across your company, your financial institution. It's actually really digging in and looking at examples of other folks that are doing this, because I think hard things are hard, and we're trying to do this in real time, and we have no time. But I think that we see really great examples globally of folks that are doing work on just transitions, how they measure it, how they advance. And that doesn't mean that you necessarily sell off all fossil fuel assets, but you need to figure out, okay, how are we going to decarbonize in a way that is just, really fair to communities and workers, but also brings in the capital that is needed at the scale and the timing that is extremely short right now.
Thanks so much, Catherine. Darren, from your point of view, with regards to this question of what investors can really do, how far investors can really be driving progress, or whether you just have to be acting within the confines of the conditions in which you find yourself, how much positive impact do you think institutional investors can really have around these issues?
Thanks, Simon. I think it can be done. I think investors can have a huge influence in transitioning economies and particular sectors, but we probably can't do it within the time bounds that's required of us. And I think that that's the challenge. When we incorporate ESG risk and opportunities, more often than not, we look at it from a ratings and a scoring perspective. And I'm talking as a colloquial we, not necessarily us. But what we do is we look at these ESG risks and opportunities, and we more than often use it as a screening mechanism. So we do our hardcore investment analysis on the side, and then we look back and say, what is the ESG rating or score of this particular company, and then make the investment decisions over there. So it very seldom actually affects asset prices. Bringing ESG risk and opportunities into the actual valuations of companies, where we start adjusting our valuation discount rates, that's when we can start seeing asset prices change over time. And that practice, as long as responsible investment has been around, is only kind of coming to that point at the moment. So we could see in effectively the 15, almost 20-year anniversary of PRI, we still grappling with ESG integration. We don't have another 20 years to get to the point where we can transition economies. We just don't have that much time. The benefit of added active engagements with companies do push them a little bit faster, incrementally at best, but it's still in very, very slow. So I believe what we do in markets, in our market here, is have these sort of metrics along our active ownership practices. So A, we get the company to commit. B, we get them to prepare these transition pathways and transition plans. C, moving on to metrics and targets, and then D, we assess and we monitor them through this process. So that's kind of, it's where we're at the moment in listed environments, and we have a lot more freedom in private markets. Again, investing in sort of renewable energy and low carbon technologies, it does help decarbonize our portfolios. And then in markets outside of African markets or global markets, we effectively track net zero aligned benchmarks. So we're doing what we can within the realms of which we're able to operate to get this decarbonization journey moving a bit quicker. But in markets like South Africa, incredibly extractive, where 80% of our national grid comes from coal-generated electricity, it's still incredibly difficult. So I actually believe that markets like South Africa, that's rushing through our developmental gears and kind of skipping steps towards financialization and service-led economies, we should maintain our current gear and refocus on green industrialization. And that green industrialization needs to be done through a whole of economy or a whole of government approach. It can reduce a lot of risks for communities, employees, companies, investors. And then I think it was to Catherine's point earlier, is that policymakers have a duty of leadership to us. But likewise do investors and companies have a duty of leadership. So some of the conversations we'll have with like our extractive companies is to still, we recognize that they still have good or great, even in some cases, global demand for their minerals. And they still employ hundreds of thousands of people. And I believe these companies should consider how best to start investing in switching their extraction capabilities towards critical minerals, with respect to biodiverse ecosystems, to support the transition. It creates a pathway for us to on-ramp onto in a green economy. It still remains incredibly risky for companies not knowing the direction of travel from a policy perspective, They don't know how global policy interventions like the carbon border adjustment mechanism would impact our markets, create stranded assets. A lot of EU regulation that has happened at the moment is incredibly beneficial for the journey within the global north, but comes at a bit of a cost to us at the global south. So I think policymakers can provide clarity in terms of specific dates through the phase out of fossil fuels, or specific timelines for the introduction of non-combustion engine requirements, help with sectorial pathways in sunset industries towards greener industries. And African governments don't have a lot of room for incentives and subsidies within their national budget, and tariffs hurt us more often than they actually benefit our economy. So inviting private investors into public-private partnerships can bridge some of those funding gaps that our national budgets struggle with. And then getting more of society into green industrialized economies, where we can achieve that GDP growth, economic development, and more productive and safer communities.
Thanks very much,
Thanks,
Darren.
Simon.
You made a really interesting point there about the duty of leadership that policymakers have towards business. And of course, that conversation is a conversation between governments and businesses. And I wonder, Senator Galvez, how good a job that you think the private sector is doing on their side of the conversation, in the way that they engage with lawmakers and with government. Are they coming to this in good faith, trying to work together towards a successful transition? Do you see them holding back progress in some cases?
I agree with the last speaker saying that there is leadership, some leadership coming from the private sector and asset managers. And listening to the opening remarks, we see that there is some people with principles, with the ethics, and with the good intentions. But what is maybe the elephant in the room is that you are all in competition. You are all competing. So we need somebody, the policymakers, to come and give the same rules. So everybody's under the same umbrella following the same rules. And so because we don't have these transition plans detailed by sector, we still have these issues with lobbies that comes, and which brings me to the situation of the COPs. So last COP, there were delegation of lobbies for fossil fuels bigger than delegations of countries and nations. So, and then and that's something that has to be addressed. And that's why we put our Bill S243, because we say, well, we have to have superseding duties that align the duties of the directors with our climate commitments, and maybe also with the biodiversity commitments, and that we have to have capital adequacy that fit the risk that are growing. We are in Canada, extreme weather events that are happening 3-4 events at billions per event. And if you ask Canada, do we have a cache of money put aside for these events? The answer is no. And if you go to the global south, it's even worse. They don't even have insurance. Jasper, only 20% of people are insured for this type of event. So there are some good, incredible leadership, but still, we have pension plans, we have insurance companies, we have the banks that needs to go all together and redirect the flow so that they come and support this transition. But it's also, I was talking about the costliness of these boards, So when you have pension plans, member boards with that sits also in fossil fuels boards, that sits also in banks board, that doesn't give that impression that we heard about the ethics and the avoidance of conflict of interest. And again, I want to go and insist in these transition plans. So the situation is very different when we talk about the global north and the global south. So of course, you see me, my color, so I come from Peru, so I am very, very interested in what is happening in the global south. And I'm very, very much interested in the transition with respect to the integration of the indigenous people, not only here in Canada, but in the whole global south. And we cannot have a second colonization, because we're going to need tons of critical minerals, and we cannot go there and repeat the same thing. So we have to show cooperation, solidarity. When I go to the meetings of the World Bank and the IMF for the spring and the fall, the parliamentarians from Africa, from South America, they are saying, can you forget a little bit of our debt so we have a chance to develop? Because we need to realize and to accept that while in parts of the world, there is the floor with everybody having access to education, health, democracy, and a clean environment, there are in the global south, they don't have yet this floor. And so there is the planetary limits, and there is the social new contract that we must sign, and we have to see our development within these two limits. So who's the leader for all of that? I think that because of the competition between some sectors, there is no choice but that the government needs to at least put good rules based on science. This is supposed to be a marathon. This transition was supposed to be a marathon, and it's not anymore. And a marathon is like a sprint, and we are all late. The other thing important, according to what I have read, is that different regions in the world choose a different approach. So when you go to United States, you have the Jobs Act and you have the IRA, and they have decided that they're going to inject trillions of money, and that this is the way that they are going to get into moving the transition. You go to Europe, and then you have the Green New Deal and these true regulations. But you go also to Asia and to China, which are the leaders in electrification, which decided that they are going to choose a different approach. So here in Canada, we have, yes, the best practices, but we have to adapt it to what we have. And Canada is heterogeneous. I come from Quebec, and in Quebec, we have very clear that our GDP is dependent on nature, on natural resources, on ecological services, and on biodiversity. You go elsewhere, not to mention the prairies, and it's different. The mentality is different. So in Quebec, what happens if maple gets the maple tree? We have 70% of the market on maple syrup. Quebec, we have, and we can export hydroelectricity. Why? Because we have big rivers, ecological services. So until we don't have solutions that will tackle all the crises at the same time, and they won't treat it as a silo, we will be always at this departure level and trying to do many things, but not being efficient.
Thanks so much, Senator. It's a marathon that's turned into a sprint, but we still have most of the distance of the marathon, and we have to sprint the whole thing. Perhaps we could use that analogy. Catherine, I think you wanted to add something.
Well, I mean, look, I was in government, and there's not enough positive lobbying. I'm just going to be really frank. I know a lot of you want nice things because there was a sustainable finance task force, which many of you signed up to. It was Barbara Svan and who was the other woman? I'm forgetting, who I know well. But anyway, you all signed up, and there was supposed to be a green taxonomy. We've been waiting years, but that was good leadership. Maybe it's going to come tomorrow, but if it includes new gas, that's not leadership. Let's be clear. And that was not what was recommended by the Sustainable Finance, the task force. But I think positive leadership is a real thing, but you actually have to be loud. And you can go to fossil fuel lobby bot, who cares? But the amount of lobbying by fossil fuel companies is extreme. And look, I tried to work with fossil fuel companies. I sat down with CEOs day after day after day. It's extremely challenging. Maybe it's just the wrong incentives that they see. But I did meet with a lot of other companies and folks that actually stood up and said we wanted to do things. So carbon pricing, unfortunately, the Carbon Pricing Leadership Coalition that many of you are part of, I haven't necessarily seen the activity, but I needed more than environmentalists when we were bringing carbon pricing into, in Canada. And so we had the Carbon Pricing Leadership Coalition. I went and knocked on doors. We got 2 banks, all 5 banks joined. That's what happens. There's a tipping point when you see leadership. And we were able to get telecom companies. We were able to get financial institutions. We did, actually, under different leadership, get one fossil fuel company. But the reality is all of you, all the folks that want and care about climate, if you've got a net zero target, in theory, you care about climate. You need things from the government. You need things, but you need to be very clear, not just in quiet meetings where you kind of whisper it. You literally need to go out and say, these are the things that we need to transition our sector to, investments, incentives, policy. And sometimes policy, I know sometimes like some people don't like policy, but policy also levels the playing field. So if you're a leader and everyone else is a laggard and everyone's saying they're green or net zero, it's very hard to distinguish. So I just would encourage folks to really think about that, because it matters going into government and saying, yes, we support carbon pricing, or we support a green taxonomy that's really green, because other countries actually have real green taxonomies and we need billions of dollars because we don't have an Inflation Reduction Act. We've got to actually attract investment in different ways because the cost to our taxpayers is too high, and we believe in this. Like the things that you need, I think it is really important because, and it could be for developing countries, we want to see a transition that actually happens. So that means we need more money from government in the form of grants so that we can leverage money from the private sector and do blended finance, whatever it is, because it actually really matters. But I think sometimes investors think that it's about engagement of folks in the market. It is not just that engagement. Yes, that's important, and there should be a price of engagement. And I know we talked about this, like engagement is good. Actually requiring action, if there isn't action, is better. And there are consequences if there's inaction. But I do think supporting governments that are trying to do good things, it's really flipping hard. It's really, really hard. And maybe you could say it's personal. Obviously, I'm sad that we may, under a new government, lose carbon pricing that's revenue neutral. The money literally goes back. It's the most conservative of a conservative policy. There was an idea from George Shultz, a Republican. But without business leaders actually standing for things and actually saying we support it, we need to transition our economy, or we're going to have massive stranded assets that are going to be a cost to the taxpayers and the people of Alberta, but across Canada, we're going to lose. And I only like winning. I'm a competitive swimmer. So I want Canada to win. I want us to create the best jobs, attract the most events. But I spent a lot of time in the States. And let me tell you, there's a big sucking sound of money to the States. Europe's worried. So they're trying to suck money. And China's just doing, massive things in China and in Asia. So I think if you want good things and you actually believe that policy is important, I cannot emphasize enough that you not only have to have secret, quiet meetings, you need to actually come together as groups of a high ambition coalition and say good things. And that should not just be in Canada if we're talking to Canadians, or if you're from a developed country. It should be saying to your government, we actually believe the transition needs to be equitable everywhere, and there are massive economic opportunities and for investment institutions and for everyone if we actually do it. So we got to flow money, and we've got to figure out blended finance.
Thanks so much, Catherine. Michael, you've got a great perspective on this, having previously worked in the government of California. In your capacity now as an institutional investor, how do you approach this question of lobbying around the transition? I'm sure you can engage with governments and policymakers in your own capacity, and also the companies that you invest in. You can be paying very careful attention to the kind of lobbying that they're doing. And I wonder how you're approaching both of those two things. And in particular, what sorts of lobbying by the companies that you invest in would seem problematic around these issues of the energy transition?
Sure. I think engagement on both fronts, both directly with government and with business, are absolutely critical. So CalPERS as an organization constantly advocates for greater disclosure. As the senator mentioned, Europe's way ahead in terms of standardizing its disclosure, whereas the US is ahead in terms of government subsidy programs through the Inflation Reduction Act. And we sort of have an experimentation there and differentiation among approaches of government. So that'll be interesting to follow, to see which one catches up and learns from the other. On the business side, I can speak from my current position as the chair of the steering committee for Climate Action 100, which is CalPERS is a founding member. And there it's really about the engagement with the businesses, trying to find common solutions to the climate crisis and figuring out ways where there is added value to our investments from an investor perspective. Climate Action 100 will put out its benchmark again later this month, and one of the factors in there is kind of the effectiveness of businesses sort of lobbying on the issues that are important. So I think in all of these issues, it's not one simple thing. It's picking all of the nuances up. And so we've hit on several of those where you need to sort of use every solution at your disposal, which will be government action as well as businesses advocating on their own behalf to sort of find ways to make the climate transition profitable for themselves.
Thanks a lot, Michael. We're getting a bit short on time, but I want to throw out a few more of the really good questions we've had coming in from the audience. Thank you for all of those. There's one from Jessica Cairns, which now has 20 thumbs up. So I think we have to ask it. Corinne, maybe for you, how do the panelists think about human rights as a risk to the transition? And are we willing to accept some negative human right impacts in the renewable energy supply chain as a trade-off, as a necessary trade-off for achieving net zero goals? How do you and EDF approach this?
I think one of the way we've approached it is first to put together finance and impact. So we are in one single entity, which means that when we are looking at all the projects that are going through the investment committee, we have to look at it with the same grammar, which I think has been used by the senator in terms of the donuts, so the planet boundaries and the social floor. And so, of course, the human rights issue before the big development in renewable was something which was seen from very far away, I think from France. But we had clearly a conflict, specifically in terms of the land acquisition. We have a project in Mexico which has been stopped because of the difficulties in terms of the land acquisition, because communities, indigenous communities, even though they didn't have land ownership, they said it's our own land, it's sacred, so you cannot do this renewable project. So this is a very huge, I would say, learning curve for sure in terms of understanding. Basically, it's not because it's good for climate that it's good on the other aspect of planet boundaries and human rights. So I think this means that we have to really co-construct or construct the project with the communities to start with. So of course it's taking a longer time, and so we have all this I would say tragedy of the horizon, because we say we have to go fast, but we won't go fast if we do it against people. So I think this is really what we're trying to do, being together between finance and impact, is to say, when you develop the project without taking into account all these issues, at the end you lose. At the end you will have problems, you will have stranded assets as well in a way, because the project will not go well, will not develop as fast. You will have development OPEX or CAPEX, and eventually you have big controversy. So it's really hard, of course, to put all of this together, but I think the only way is to really be together between finance and impact and speak the same language, have the same understanding of all these planetary boundary and social issues together.
Thanks so much, Corinne. Darren, one for you, if that's okay. There's a question here from Anneke van Wodenberg, talking about a really important point here, that the just transition is not only about the jobs being lost, but also about the jobs that are being created. Far too many green energy jobs, especially those in the global south, are underpaid. She gives, as an example, mine workers at cobalt mines in DR Congo. How can investors ensure that the transition doesn't exacerbate inequality? How can investors make sure that the companies they're financing or investing in are creating good jobs? What's the right approach, do you think, Darren?
Very good question. I'll focus on the first part and then come back to the cobalt mining in a second. 100% agree that the just transition should not just be about the people losing their jobs, but also how do you crowd in new jobs into the economy. South Africa is one of those economies where we have about 35 to 40%, depending on the year, of people outside of our economy. That's our unemployment rate. It is amongst the highest in the world, and our inequality is the worst in the world. We are the number one most unequal country in the world. So for us, it's critical about managing that process. We're not able to lose 100,000 jobs effectively in one sector, because that exasperates the 40% unemployment that we're experiencing. So the green industrialization approach should be about finding new sectors that we can onshore into the South African economy specifically. So we are big exporters of internal combustion engine cars into Europe and into the US. Building electric vehicles, for example, in South Africa expands that range significantly. It grows that industry, and it also becomes a opportunity for our current ICE export industry to then transition over to electric vehicles over time. And then that comes again to the critical minerals conversation. South Africa and Africa are big extractive economies as well. Doing that in a way that respects human rights is critical. In markets like Congo and the cobalt and Sudan as well, and the cobalt extraction process that's happening over there, that really is a function of just the world being incredibly blind to it. Supply chain transparency is amongst the hardest things for us to get to get companies that we're investing to do. So what we would like to see at some point is investors declaring companies we invest in declaring all their scope 3 emissions, but also going through the supply chain and performing these human right violation conversations over there. It's the only way we're going to get visibility is to see exactly where the exploitation is happening, who's benefiting from the illegal mining that's happening in those spaces, that is exploiting the communities in which they operate. And then from that perspective, it's again about getting the transition to happen over there. But completely agree, the green industrialization process for South Africa and Africa is a huge job positive environment, but we have to be mindful of the extremely difficult scenario and the exclusionary environment we operate in South Africa, where we have about 40% unemployment.
Thank you so much, Darren. Thank you to all the audience for these brilliant questions. We've had so many coming in. I'm sorry we've only been able to get to a few of them. You'll just have to try and grab the speakers before they leave the conference center after this session. Now time to press on with the rest of the event. In the meantime, please do join me in thanking the panelists for a wonderful conversation. Thank you.